What's up, guys? The boring draws have finally come to an end. This is game 6 in the FIDE World Chess Championship, and we had some very exciting things happen, including breaking the world record for the longest game ever in a World Chess Championship, and we will get into that more when we get to that point in the game, but let's see what happened. So Magnus is playing with white, and we have d4, knight of 6, knight of 3, d5, g3, and it's interesting that Magnus is delaying playing c4. This is a really common move, and usually you play it fairly early, and you'll notice that Magnus doesn't do that. And so this is basically delaying this move is kind of taking the game into somewhat uncharted territory. Now, of course, he can still transition back into something a little more popular, but you notice he keeps delaying that move. And now he plays b3, and it's really a question of, is he even going to play that at all? He might just fianchetto the bishop, continue developing the pieces, maybe hop a knight into e5, and just completely not even play this move. So c5, he captures, and now comes c4, and as far as I know, this position has not been played in master games, at least not according to the Lichess database, and so we're kind of in somewhat uncharted territory already. Now we have captures, and an interesting move here, queen to c2, and the idea is he's pinning this pawn so that if black tries to capture on b3, Magnus would just take the bishop on c5, so that's why he doesn't have to take back right away, and this way he avoids the queen trades, which I'm sure we're all happy to see. So we have queen e7. Jan is defending the bishop so that this does become a threat, and yet still Magnus plays knight bd2, allowing this pawn capture. So he's basically sacrificing a pawn, and I think the idea is that after recaptures, now there's a tempo being gained on the bishop. Bishop has to move somewhere, and Magnus is going to have the open b file, and the extra time that he gained by chasing the bishop away means that black is kind of undeveloped here, and Magnus can honestly, I don't know what Magnus's plan was here. Maybe bishop b2, putting the bishop on this diagonal. Engine seems to like the move knight a5, which is kind of an interesting way to approach the position. I guess the idea is that if b6 ever happens, you have to watch out for the bishop on the long diagonal here. Also, knight fd2, opening up the bishop, could be played. Things like bringing a rook over at some point. Lots of different ways this game could have gone. So I'm not exactly sure what his plan was, but it doesn't really matter because Jan decided to not accept the pawn sacrifice and just go ahead and develop the knight, which is a sensible option. So captures, and then b5, knight comes into e5, and this is an interesting place for the queen because normally you would want like your bishop to go there potentially. And so queen b2 I thought was an interesting move, but okay, bishop b7. Engine is saying everything is just completely equal. And you can kind of see why, right? The pawns are all the same. You got 2 against 2, 4 against 4. Pieces pretty even. And bishop g5. He trades here, and now we start to finally see a little bit of imbalance in the position. This capture with the g-pawn opens up black's king to some extent, although it's not really easy to exploit that. The king can always kind of tuck away on h8. Potentially this could be used to attack, although very well defended on g3, probably not going to happen anytime soon, but it does create some imbalance. And this pawn, even though there's double pawns, you do gain a lot of control over these squares over here, and you can really push either of these pawns forward at some point. So interesting position. The rook comes to the open file. We get a couple of trades here. And now here's kind of I think an instructive moment. Magnus plays king g1, and the thing about these pawns is if you ever commit a pawn forward, like f3 kind of seems like a decent move as well, you are creating weaknesses that you can't ever fix. So for example, these squares now become open to the bishop, and since pawns can't move backwards, you're going to have to deal with that for the rest of the game. So Magnus decided to play king g1, and yes, you have to watch out for this, but the queen by itself isn't going to be able to do anything, and this way the bishop can't get through. So king g1, queen comes to e4. It's a nice central square. This is one of the things you'll notice a lot of strong players like to do, is place their pieces on central squares, because if you remember, the whole point behind why we like to fight for the center when we play chess is that pieces control more squares in the center of the board than they do in like the corner or along the edge. And so in this position, black's queen is doing much better than white's queen, just simply because of the placement. Okay, and then the bishop also is doing a nice job in the center. The knight's pretty well placed though, defended by the pawn, so white does have that. Queen c2, a5, rook comes over, and right here is where we start to get an interesting position. So rook c8 allows white the option to give up the queen in exchange for the two rooks. And if anything, this is probably a benefit to white. And the reason is because the two rooks can help each other. You can connect them where they protect each other, and you can attack, let's just say, a pawn. And even if the queen tries to defend the pawn, well, you can still capture the pawn because you can have both rooks lined up on it. So long term, this is actually a good trade for white. Now, you do have to be very careful because the queen is very powerful, and a lot of beginners have a hard time. There's lots of forks and tricks and tactics where you can actually lose one of those rooks if you're not careful. But we're going to see at the top level how Magnus is able to kind of use those rooks and create some chances. So, practically speaking, if you add up the points, right, each rook is 5 points. So you end up with 10 points, whereas the queen is 9 points. And so there's a little bit of an advantage built into that scoring system. And that you kind of do see that practically speaking. A lot of times the rooks do have a nice time. So now that being said, this bishop is very strong in the center. And so it's not that simple. All right, so queen d5, b4, a4, at e3. Which is kind of a committal move, but one of the things you'll notice is that all of the pawns are on the same color as the bishop, which kind of limits the bishop's ability to go places, right? Because the squares, the pawns take away squares that the bishop would potentially like to go to. That being said, you do have to be careful at some point that the bishop can't capture some of these pawns, right? So it's kind of a trade-off. At this point, the commentators were kind of expecting the move bishop to b2, and this is a crazy move because you're putting the bishop where the knight and the rook can both capture it. Now, the point is that tactically speaking, it just doesn't work for white. So for example, if you take with the knight, well, then you're losing your rook on d2, so you don't want to do that. And if you take with the rook, now black can take here and they get the piece back. They're also threatening this pawn. The only way you can defend it is by going here, but then you fall into this little tactic check. You have to move your king, and then there's this fork where you end up losing your rook. So because of that, white really couldn't take the bishop either way and would have to do something like rook c5. Queen would have to move. Queen has to stay along this file because, for example, if you try to move the queen off the file, let's say over to b3, well, now white can take the bishop, and you just, white just won a piece. And so, Jan would have to play something like queen d6, and then, white can maybe play rook down here. You could trade, but then, you're probably losing this pawn. It's unclear what's happening here, but that seemed like black's best chance, bishop to b2 in this position. But Jan actually played bishop to e5, and then we have h4. And, one of the things to notice at this point in the game is check out Magnus's time here, this 6:28. So he's down to 6 minutes, and he still has to get 10 more moves in. So that's a lot of moves for such an intense game like this, but you'd really like to think a lot more than 6 minutes on 10 moves, but that's the situation that he's in. So h5, king to h2. Again, look at Magnus's clock, really getting low on time. And king h2 is actually a useful move just to kind of get out of the potential checks from the queen along the back rank. So king h2, a nice move there. And now Jan goes for bishop b2, which, probably was a little bit better earlier on, but now he's kind of going for the same idea. Again, if the knight takes, then the rook is hanging. And if the rook takes, again, you can take on d3, you have pressure here. Now, rook a2 actually is a move for white in this case because the king's not on the back rank anymore. There's no more tricks to win the rook. So probably a little bit better for white than before. But he does go for bishop b2. Magnus plays rook c5, so throwing in this move to attack the queen. Queen goes back, and again, there's the same pin here, so you still can't really take the bishop. Rook to d1, and this is actually a moment in the game where the commentators were very surprised. So Magnus had the option here to go with this move, rook c to c2, and basically you're protecting your rook, so now there's no more pin. Your knight is free to move. You actually have, lots of threats on the bishop. And where's the bishop going to go is kind of the question. If you play bishop e5, then you have f4. Bishop is basically trapped. So the only thing that black could do is really take here. And now white has this really nice idea, knight to f4, unleashing the rooks. And you're actually going to go for an attack on the king. And check this out. Let's say the queen moves like if you try to take the pawn, rook's going to come down, and you're going to bring this rook down, and black's actually in a lot of trouble. And so this was a really good idea. As an example, let's just see. Best move according to the engine is queen b1. Then this rook comes down. Best move is king to g8. And I'm just going to follow the engine here because I want to see what it says. If the king comes up, you have knight takes e6 check because this is pinned. And then the king looks like getting mated, or something not good is going to happen after it runs over here. Rook to e8. It's pretty tricky, but the point is the king is in trouble, right? Once the rooks get in like that and the knight is able to help, you've got all sorts of ideas with the knight. You've got all different ways to attack the king with the rooks. And even though black has 2 pawns, most likely black's going to get mated, and this doesn't even matter. So really interesting idea that was probably just winning for Magnus if he would have just played rook c to c2. Now that being said, you know, keep in mind he only had 3 minutes on the clock. He still had to make, what is this, move 33. So he still has to make 7 moves, and you know, maybe he didn't have time to calculate all that and wasn't sure, and decided because he didn't have time to calculate it all out to go with a somewhat safer move, rook d1. Although, you know, now you still have the pin on your knight, and it's not as nice for white. So bishop takes a3, rook takes b5, queen to d7. There's an attack here. They're still maintaining the pin on the knight. Rook to c5. e5 is a very tricky move, and opening up the queen, blocking off the rook from attacking this pawn is important, because in some lines white wanted to take that. Rook comes back, and again, Magnus, you can see the time here, 110, right? And if we're only on move 36, he's also to make 4 moves, and there's no increment or anything yet. So this is very, very low time for a position like this. That's very tricky. Brings his rook up. Queen goes here. Rook to a2. He's trying to kind of set up this sort of fortress thing where this pawn is blockaded. Everything's kind of defended now. See how all these pieces are defended. And we get e4. Knight comes in, and this is move 39. So Magnus has to make 1 more move in 30 seconds. And you can see Jan's time actually has gone down as well to 30 seconds. So Jan captures here. Both players are in time pressure. Knight takes e4 is time control for Magnus. Now he gets an hour added onto the clock. And the point here is that if the queen takes, you have rook takes a3. You're going to be able to win this pawn for sure. You can play rook up and take it like this. And once you get that position, it's really good for white, because the 2 rooks are going to be able to pile up on the pawns. And even if the queen and the king defend it, you can just trade your rooks for the queen and the pawn, and you're going to come out into a winning pawn endgame, right? You see white has 4 pawns, black is only going to have these 3. So if those pieces get traded in this situation, it's just going to be winning for white. So Jan plays queen b3. Okay, the rook comes over, bishop comes back, and what Jan wants to do is put this pawn on a3, keep it defended, and hopefully that pawn is going to prevent white from doing anything with the rooks, and that's going to be basically black's way to draw the game. So knight comes in, queen goes here, knight comes back, and then a3. And according to the engine at this point, the game is a draw, and it has to do with the fact that this pawn, you know, is going to keep some of white's pieces tied down, guarding it. But at the same time, how's black going to ever push it forward, right? I mean, there's 2 rooks here lined up. You can't use the bishop because bishops can't change color. And even if you get your queen there, it doesn't matter. There's 2 rooks. So basically, you know, probably a draw with perfect play. That being said, Magnus is going to try to do some tricks because these pawns are very weak. All right, like if this pawn was over on g6, this would be a different story. Everything's kind of defended. But in this case, there are targets. And, you know, we get this kind of interesting dynamic where black is trying to sort of check with the queen if possible. White's trying to keep their king tucked away. Very interesting stuff. So queen goes here. The rook goes ahead and blockades the pawn. Bishop comes here. And I'm going to go a little bit quickly through some of these moves just because they did a lot of kind of back and forth here. And eventually we get to a critical moment, and I'm going to try to get to that point. Yes, so let's see, where was it at? Yeah, right here, I don't know that queen e4 was a good move because black essentially gives white the option to take this pawn. So for example, like if black just plays king g7, I'm not really sure what white is going to do to make progress. Like if black just moves the king back and forth, let's say, I don't know what white's going to do because of this pawn. Because this pawn is defended here, it's very hard for white to do anything. But as soon as, let me go back to the game, as soon as black plays queen e4, well, now Magnus has the option to play rook takes a3. And you're probably thinking, well, the bishop can just take the rook, right? The idea is that after takes, the rook and the knight are going to be able to win some of these pawns, kind of similarly to how the two rooks could do it. Same thing's going to happen with the rook and the knight. Eventually, the rook and the knight are going to line up on the pawn, and even if the queen and king defend it, you're still going to just take it with your rook and your knight. And then black's in trouble, right? So because of that, Jan doesn't want to trade this, even though it's bishop for a rook is normally good. In this case, it's just not what you want. So queen takes h4, I guess, was his idea behind going there, because he's going to open up the king a little bit. But really, if we go back to this position, you know, if you were to ask Jan, hey, do you want to trade this pawn for this pawn? His answer would be no. Like, I don't want to do that. So I'm not really sure what the point was here with queen e4. That was pretty big mistake, I would say. But anyway, queen e4, we get the trade. King comes back, and basically now, you know, Magnus is trying to figure out a couple things. Number one, how do I keep my king from getting perpetual checked by the queen? But also, how can I eventually either maybe trade these pieces would be good, or somehow position my rooks and knight to pile up on probably this pawn, or maybe even like if you can get both rooks on the 7th rank, which all of these things are easier said than done, because black's queen is going to be jumping around trying to put you in check. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on. Rook comes here, and then we get some more maneuvering. And again, if you check Magnus's time, 4 minutes, he's getting a little bit low, but at this point he just has to make a few more moves. Oh, actually, that was the last move. So there's the time control, 60 moves, and he gets another you know, time added. Okay, so f4, bishop goes back, king comes over, and there's all sorts of stuff here where you have to watch out for the queen coming over here, putting you in check from this side. One of the things about knights in chess, they are the best defenders against queens, and it has to do with the fact that, you know, if you look at the king and the knight for a second, where would the queen potentially want to put you in check from? Well, this way, blocked by the knight. Maybe this way, and there's a pawn obviously, but the knight also covered that square. And so knights are very good defenders of kings. So, all right, so the rook comes down. Let's keep moving here. Eventually, okay, the rooks come into the back, so black has to be careful because there's potentially some dangers happening here. We get a lot of maneuvering, and I want to get to the next kind of critical moment in the game, which is, let's get to it. And so here, you know, Magnus was kind of repeating some moves to get some time on his clock. They're in the part of the game where you get 30 seconds per move. That was actually after the 60 move mark, even though it's the final time control. Now they do get the increment. So they're playing on increment here. So finally, the pawn does get captured here on f5, which is a small thing, but it's one step in the right direction. And Jan plays queen d3, and now Magnus had a really nice move. If you want to pause the video, if you haven't seen the game already, what do you think Magnus played here? And this is pretty deep, so if you don't find it, don't sweat it, but I'll give you a second. What do you think he played? Well, the move was rook takes f7 check, and basically what he's doing is saying, okay, I'm going to give up the rook, because after you take, I have a fork where I'm going to get the bishop as well. And so we end up with a rook, a knight, these 3 pawns, and the queen and the pawn. And basically Magnus's plan is going to be to somehow, using the rook and the knight, push these pawns down and either checkmate the king or somehow force black to give up the queen, or, you know, or win the queen with some tactic, right? That's the plan. Black's plan to draw the game is going to be to continually put white's king in check, some sort of perpetual check, right? As the pawns start moving forward, the king is going to have to figure out, is there a safe place? And if not, the queen's just going to go check, 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 check forever, right? So that's kind of what's going on. And by the way, both players, you can see Magnus at 2:39, Jan at 4:55. Both players are under 5 minutes on the clock. So very tricky position. And practically speaking, white has the better chances, because really black's not going to win this game anymore. White can just park their pieces on some nice squares where everything's protected and the queen can't do anything. It's Magnus who's trying to win at this point. So, all right, check. We get some maneuvering here. And let's get to the next kind of interesting moment. Now, one of the things I want to mention as we kind of keep going back and forth here, but if you get the same position in chess 3 times, the game is a draw, okay? And it doesn't have to be the exact same moves back and forth. Any position that has occurred before, even if there was like 50 moves in between, if that same position happens 3 times, it's a draw. And so one of the things that Magnus was calculating here was, have we had this position before? Because the queen has been jumping around for a while. If I go back a couple of moves, the rook and the knight have kind of been blocking. And this position here, you know, where the queen's on b1, the rook is somewhere. Magnus has to be careful that he remembers, have we had this position before or not, right? So that's an important part about what's going on here. So eventually, Magnus has to make a decision to do something different. Otherwise, they are going to repeat moves. Okay. And so one thing here is that now the king's on f6 instead of where it was back on the 7th rank. And then right here, knight g1 is kind of a new and different move. And Magnus is basically saying, okay, I don't want to repeat moves. I need to do something different. And so he goes for knight g1. And then we get knight to e2. Okay. So he maneuvered the knight to e2 where it was previously on f3. And now you're going to see why. He's able to play e4. This was a crucial pawn push that he was trying to do for a while, but previously he wasn't able to do it. Okay, so he had to maneuver all these pieces around to be able to play e4. All right, so the queen comes over, check, comes back. And now the pawns get traded. All right, now we're in a position where I need to talk about table bases. Now, a table base is a database that stores endgame positions. I believe it's if there's 7 pieces or less on the board. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Basically, the table base will tell you if the position is a win or a draw or a loss or whatever. And the table base is saying that this position is technically a draw. So with perfect play from both sides, the game should be a draw, right? We just know that from the table base. The problem is, the players obviously don't have access to the table base to tell them what the best moves are, right? So, you know, practically speaking, Jan has 4 minutes, Magnus has 2 minutes. Very difficult position for black to play because you have to play everything perfectly. If you mess up at some point, then that's what's supposed to be a draw. It's not going to be a draw. So keep that in mind as we go through these last moves. Okay, so Magnus is trying to figure out a way to push his pawns forward while at the same time avoiding the checks on his king from the queen. Okay, so he maneuvers his king over here. And eventually he gets to a point where he's comfortable pushing the pawns. So he puts the rook kind of in front, which is interesting. The knight is behind, and now he pushes, okay? And you're going to notice the knight is an awesome defender, like I talked about earlier, of the queen. Can't check this way. Even if the queen could somehow get to this square, you couldn't do it because the knight. Even if the queen could get to this square, you couldn't do it because the knight. Here, knight just covers all of these squares where the queen would like to go to put the king in check. So really difficult position. So he goes here to pin the rook. Magnus just brings the king up. Again, blocking with the knight. And it's hard for the queen to put the king in check, right? Everything is defended by the knight. And okay, and let's see, where did it change? So right at this moment, the table base says it's a draw. As soon as the queen goes to e6, it's no longer a draw, now it's a win. And so the only drawing moves were queen to b1 and queen to c2. And the point is you're still putting some pressure on the rook, but you're keeping the queen back here so that you have the potential to check from behind. As soon as the queen goes to e6, it loses the ability to check from behind. And because of the way white's pieces are positioned, white's able to prevent checks. And now it's just a one game for white. So knight comes in, pawn goes up. This is a nice sacrifice. If the queen takes, the knight comes in for the fork. And this is going to be a winning endgame. King e7 takes, and white's just going to win. So can't do that. Queen here, the rook comes down. Again, if the queen takes, there's another nice little fork. Check. And this is interesting because black does actually get all the pieces except the pawn, but this is a winning king and pawn endgame. So king g5, king f7, and the reason it's a win is because of the opposition. Whenever you put your king directly opposed to your opponent's king like this, that's called opposition. And because white played the move, white has the opposition, which forces black's king, eventually it's going to force the king to the side, which is not what black wants to do. And so if they go back, you can get opposition again. Now, because it's on the edge of the board, it has to go to the side, which allows you to take control of the queening square, and the pawn just goes, gets the queen, and white wins. So let's go back. So that's the idea behind playing rook to f7. Yeah, and there's really not anything that black can do. There's no checks. The knight could potentially come in, and basically what white is trying to do is escort this pawn down for a queen. So the king moves over, this pawn comes up, queen goes down, knight comes in, and here Jan resigned. So we have our first win of the tournament. And you know, if you're wondering why, like for example, check, the king's gonna go here, check, the king's gonna go here, check, king's gonna go here, check, and eventually it's gonna sneak around and hide right here. There's no more checks, and you know, let's just say queen b4. White can just, simplest thing is just push this pawn, then push this pawn, rook, get a queen, right? And you see how the king is very safe. There's no checks, right? So fantastic game. Really tough position to draw for Jan, even though it was a draw if we go all the way back. Like we talked about, this move queen e6 was the crucial mistake. But you know, to figure that out over the board after such a long game with 3 minutes on the clock, it's you know, practically impossible. So really nice game. I'm super excited that this happened, not only because we got a nice game here, but because, you know, this is probably going to set the tone for the match. Like, Jan is not going to be able to just be content drawing from here on out. He's going to lose eventually because now Magnus has the lead. So I think this is going to lead to some more interesting games going forward. At least that's my hope. Oh, and one thing I totally forgot to mention, my bad. Let me go back. So I just went back to this position. This is move 123. And after king g2, queen b7, rook to d2, this was when they broke the world record for the longest game in a world championship match. So it was back in 1978, 124 move stalemate. And here we have move 125. So they broke that record. And actually the game continued all the way up until, let's see, right here after knight g7 was the resignation. So move 136 and the game was a draw. So fascinating stuff. I'm really glad this happened. I think this is going to set the tone, like I said, going forward for some more exciting chess. Wow. What a game. Thank you guys for tuning in. As always, stay sharp, play smart, take care, and I'll see you in game 7.